So we have moved locations again, and where are we now teaching?
So we are on Gadigal country still, and that, for those of you who don't know, is in inner South Sydney. This place is also quite important for contemporary, for Indigenous communities in sort of the modern era as well. It's an important site where a lot of people set up housing and set up communities, particularly after the 1960s. Specifically, we are near the Waterloo MetroStation, which is in front of the Waterloo Public Housing Estate.
Yeah, the station is currently under construction,
Yes.
right? We can hear a little bit of the background noise happening there.
Yeah, so you can see this blue board, and Waterloo Station is right over here. So I really wanted to talk to you about how this station came to be situated here. So the Sydney Metro line is one of the largest public transport projects, I believe, in Australia. And the Waterloo Station that you've got over here, that is actually a new stop that is part of this Metro line. And when it's completed, the line will have 31 stations in total. And it will run, this part of the line will connect Waterloo and run into the northwest of Sydney, connecting Waterloo to the CBD and the sort of Chatswood area in the northwest of the city, which is, I guess quite an important connection, right? And eventually the line is supposed to serve, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it's supposed to serve around 40,000 people per hour. So
wow.
It's going to be up there with the other metro stations. So coming back to the story of how this sort of site, how the Waterloo site was selected. It's an interesting story. So there's the Cabinet Infrastructure Committee, this was in 2016, was tasked with locating stations for the line in different parts of Sydney. And this particular station could have been located here at Waterloo, or the other option was the University of Sydney, which is about a 20-minute walk away, would you say?
Yeah.
And the university had been lobbying for a while to have a station situated next to it. But the decision about where to locate the station, these were the two options, came down to this Cabinet Infrastructure Committee, which is the New South Wales body. And the committee was split in its decision. So you had, I believe, the Transport Minister at the time, the, who else was it? The Roads Minister as well. And I can't remember, there was another particular ministerial portfolio who all voted for the station to go to Sydney Uni because of the commuter base. A lot of the university students get off at Redfern Station and walk from Redfern Station to the university. So instead of having that walk, you could have the station straight at the university, and it would alleviate Redfern Station's traffic. So there were 3 ministers who voted for the station to be at Sydney Uni. But the police minister at the time, the social housing minister, and I believe the planning minister cast their votes in favour of the station being opposite the estate. And the premier at the time sided with them, voted with them, and that's how the station came to be located here.
I see.
Now, there's an interesting politics to this, right? Redfern and Waterloo have been sites for regeneration for a while, especially since 2004. The New South Wales government has been placing pressure to redevelop this area. They're important sites of controlled rental housing, so the Waterloo Public Housing Estate, the Redfern Public Estate are located in this area. The idea behind locating the station here, the driving force was to initiate a process of value capture, so to redevelop the Waterloo estate. So by providing a transport amenity, what you do is you actually increase the land value. By locating the station opposite the estate, you're actually raising the land value of the public housing estate, of the land that it sits on.
Yeah.
And that is attractive to developers, obviously.
Yeah.
So the New South Wales social housing minister at the time was very much committed to redeveloping the public housing estate, which has been talked about as an aging estate. It's been stigmatized as a site of crime. It's been in media narratives and government narratives. It's been depicted as quite an unpleasant place. The truth isn't necessarily like that sort of bleak, but that's how it's been depicted. And so what they could do is, by raising the land value, you can attract private development into the area, and part of the land will be privatized and the site of private housing, and part of the money that is generated through that will be directed to the redevelopment of the social housing, because there's been an uplift in land value, essentially, and that's how the government is leveraging sort of private sector funding to redevelop the estate. Now, the other interesting thing about this, the model that they use, is quite interesting in the sense that when the government privatizes this land, it doesn't actually get any money from the private developers, right? That, at least that's the initial model, which might change because there has been recent changes in these proposals. But the original model in 2016 was that the land would be alienated, given away for private sector development, and the government would not receive direct money from transferring that land for private sector development. The money would be in the form of the redevelopment of the housing estate. So that's how the original model worked. But like I said, there have been changes since. But the other thing that I want to draw your attention to, and also draw the attention to of the students, is that this site, Waterloo, the housing estate, it's home, or it houses over 2,000 dwellings, and we think it's home to over 3,000 public housing tenants who have controlled rents. And it's a really important place to enable low-income people to live in the middle of the city. It's one of the few sites in inner Sydney where there is controlled rent, and where people, can afford to live, even if they're on low incomes. A lot of people who are retired, who are on the government pension, live over here. I know some of these people. And it's also a really important site for Indigenous communities. I think a significant part of the people renting here are Indigenous. Some of those people actually previously lived on the block in Redfern, which was a housing cooperative, a black housing cooperative that was set up. So when evictions happened at this black housing cooperative, some of the tenants there moved to the Waterloo Estate. So it is a really important site to provide housing for people who have previously been excluded from the city. And that, I think, is also, that's why I think sometimes these projects like this don't always sufficiently take into account they may the sort of material and political importance of such sites. They may do that. They may claim to do that through documents that are released, etc. But when the actual redevelopment happens, and when it comes down to allocating enough social housing here or enough housing for Indigenous people, there are question marks as to, whether that will actually be happening, and whether and how, and whether this will still continue to be a sort of important centre for people like that.
Of course. So what we are seeing here is a history of redevelopment, of displacement, of a very important site. We have communities here that have lived for decades in this area, and they're for different, countries, and so we have a community that will be...
So absolutely, there's also a big Russian and Chinese community over here. And the other thing to mention, on the point of displacement, I know that the government has said everyone will be able to be rehoused here, and the redevelopment will be happening in stages, so that people will be moved out and then moved back in. So there is a commitment to not physically displace them. But the thing is that when you, the housing estate will be redeveloped into 70% private and 30%, the initial plans were 70% private, 30% public. Under the latest iterations, I believe that the amount of affordable housing has increased.
Yeah.
So under the latest City of Sydney plans. But regardless, you're surrounding what used to be a site of public housing with controlled rents with sort of private housing, and that is disrupting of a community that doesn't have a lot of economic power. So displacement can happen in different ways. It can be physical displacement, but then there's also sort of a social and racialized displacement that can happen in place while you're still there, but everything around you changes, but changes in a way that it becomes less affordable for you, or it becomes, it takes away land that was used by low-income communities, and I don't think that's a good precedent to set.
No, of course not. What we see here today, it might be radically different in 20 years' time, right?
Yeah.
Because the project has that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I'm not saying, you know, like when you put forward these arguments, you're also often told you're anti-change, gentrification is just, you know, a natural process. But this is not a natural process. As I talked about the infrastructure committee meeting, decisions were made to make this happen. This is not a natural process. And secondly, change is always happening in a city. It is part of urban life. The question is the quality of change, right? There's no point saying you're anti-change or, you know, we need change. What is the quality of change? And if you value social justice, if you value the lives of low-income communities and of Black people for whom this was an important political center, then you probably will ask questions about what is the character of change here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, as we can see, urban geographers pay attention to the politics of place and space. We pay very close attention to what's happening when the city gets to be transformed, actively transformed all the time. But we also want to influence those processes into a more just, fair process for everybody, right? And inclusive.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Pratichi. That was great.
No, all good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.